It is January 2022, and conservation scientist James Gibbs is on his hands and knees in a tangle of brush on the southwestern plateau of Espanola Island. He and his survey team have been cutting through dense thickets for 10 days. Their clothes are shredded by the clawing branches, the lava rock beneath their boots is uneven and sharp. The equatorial sun is relentless. Then, without warning, the scrub opens. The vegetation falls away and there is a wide clearing on the bare stone, and in that clearing, dozens of waved albatrosses are gathered, not scattered, clustered, sitting and preening and performing the extraordinary bill-clacking courtship display that biologists had recorded on this island for more than a century. Gibbs had not stumbled onto a secret colony. He had found something stranger and more significant. These clearings, cutting through otherwise impenetrable thickets, followed a pattern that matched no wind direction, no drainage feature, no geological formation his team had expected. They matched the movement corridors of giant tortoises. The tortoises were mowing the runway, cutting the path, and because of that, the only breeding colony of waved albatross on the planet was still alive. Gibbs later described the realization as one of those moments when you know the data is telling you something much larger than the numbers on the page. The tortoises and the birds, he said, simply cannot have one without the other. He was not speaking metaphorically, he was describing a precise mechanical dependency that had existed on this island for millions of years and had almost, within living memory, been lost forever. This is the story of how a species reduced to 14 individuals on a remote volcanic island at the edge of the Pacific became the unlikely architect of an entire ecosystem. It is the story of a captive breeding program that most scientists considered a biological longshot, built on the work of a tortoise retrieved from a zoo in California. It is the story of what those animals did when they came back, and why almost nobody predicted it, and why the results still surprise the researchers who have spent their careers studying them. To understand why this matters, you need to know what was lost. Espanola is the oldest island in the Galapagos archipelago. It sits in the far southeast of the chain, roughly 960 kilometers off the coast of Ecuador, formed from volcanic rock that solidified more than 3.5 million years ago. It is flat, low, and wind-battered. It has no freshwater streams. It has no permanent human population. It looks at first glance like a place nothing should want to live, but for millions of years, life found a way. The island developed its own endemic species found nowhere else on Earth. The Espanola mockingbird, the Espanola lava lizard, the Galapagos hawk, the marine iguana that clings to the shoreline cliffs and dives into the cold Pacific to graze on algae. And above all others, in terms of ecological weight and influence, the Chelonoidis hoodensis, the Hood Island giant tortoise. These animals were not simply the island's largest inhabitants, they were its engineers. A full-grown Espanola tortoise can weigh over 250 pounds and live past 150 years. They are built for endurance in a way almost nothing else on Earth is. They can survive months without food or water, drawing energy from fat reserves accumulated during the wet season. Their shells protect them from every predator their island ever produced. They evolved in a place where nothing hunted them and everything depended on them. And over millions of years their movement patterns became the organising logic of the entire ecosystem. As they travelled the island, in their slow, seasonal migrations between the coast and the interior, they grazed on grasses and on the fallen pads of the giant Opuntia cactus, the towering prickly pear that grows across Espanola's interior in forms found nowhere else in the archipelago. They consumed cactus fruits whole, passing the seeds intact through their digestive systems and depositing them across the island in dense balls of dung that carried both seed and fertilizer in a single package. They trampled shrubs and saplings, clearing open ground wherever they walked, preventing any single plant community from locking up the landscape. The island's vegetation was not incidental to the tortoises, it was shaped by them, maintained by them, over millions of years of coevolution. Conservationists who study these relationships use the term ecosystem engineer, a species whose physical activity changes the habitat for every other species around it. Beavers build dams that alter hydrology across entire watersheds. Elephants push over trees and create grassland patches used by dozens of other species. Espanola's tortoises were the engineers of everything. By most estimates, more than 10,000 of them once lived on the island. They had been doing this work for so long and so continuously that nothing on the island had evolved without them present. The grasses, the cactus, the birds, the lizards, all of it developed alongside the tortoises in a system where the tortoises were a constant. Remove the constant, and the entire equation changes. Then the ships came. Beginning in the 17th century, pirates and buccaneers discovered the Galapagos Islands as a refuge and watering stop in the empty Pacific. They were followed by whalers, who arrived in force in the early 19th century and found the tortoises irresistible. A single large animal could provide several hundred pounds of meat. The creatures could survive for months in a ship's hull without food or water, providing fresh protein across thousands of miles of open ocean. They were, in the language of the time, living provisions. Historians estimate that more than 100,000 tortoises were removed from the Galapagos archipelago during the whaling era. They were not hunted in the conventional sense, they were collected. Flipped onto their backs, tied to poles, hauled to the ships 2 and 3 men to a side. They were so docile that the process required almost no effort. They had no idea what was happening to them. Hispaniola was especially vulnerable. It is one of the flattest and most accessible islands in the chain. Ships could anchor close to shore, and the tortoises could be collected with minimal effort. They had no fear of people. There was nothing in their evolutionary history that had ever tried to kill them. A mature Hispaniola tortoise standing its ground against a sailor simply watched. It did not retreat. It did not resist. The sailors walked up, flipped it onto its back, and carried it away. The entire collapse of a population that had taken millions of years to build happened in the span of roughly 150 years. Almost nobody was tracking it. Almost nobody was watching the numbers fall. By the time anyone looked closely enough to measure what remained, the answer was 14. And as if the hunting were not enough, the sailors left something behind. Goats. First introduced to provide future food stores for passing ships, the feral goat population spread across the island and began systematically destroying the vegetation the tortoises needed. They overgrazed the grasses, they stripped cactus pads from the base of every plant within reach. They eliminated the shade-giving and water-catching vegetation that allowed the tortoises to survive the dry season. They altered the competitive relationships between plants in ways that would take researchers decades to fully understand. By the 1960s, when the Charles Darwin Research Station on Santa Cruz Island began systematically surveying tortoise populations across the archipelago, the news from Hispaniola was devastating. The entire population of Chelonoidis hudensis had been reduced to 14 individuals, 2 males, 12 females, scattered across the island in such low density that their reproductive rate had effectively collapsed. The animals were too far apart to reliably find each other during breeding season. The models were not encouraging. Scientists looking at those numbers did not see a species that could recover. They saw a species that had already lost. The island itself reflected that loss. Woody shrubs, freed from the grazing pressure of the tortoises for decades, were expanding unchecked through the interior. Open ground was disappearing. Cactus regeneration had dropped to almost nothing. Hispaniola was changing slowly and silently into something it had never been. The decision to intervene came from the Charles Darwin Research Station, established on Santa Cruz Island in 1960 with support from the Ecuadorian government and international conservation organisations. The researchers there understood that without dramatic intervention, several tortoise subspecies would be functionally extinct within a generation. Captive breeding was the only option that made biological sense. It was not a popular idea in all quarters. Critics pointed out that it was expensive, logistically demanding, and that releasing animals back onto an island still overrun by the goats that had destroyed it was setting up a cycle that solved nothing. They were not entirely wrong. The program would require patience measured in decades, not years. Nobody in conservation circles at the time was accustomed to planning on that timescale. But the biologists at the station and the Galapagos National Park Directorate pushed forward. Between 1964 and 1974, park officials made one of the most consequential decisions in the history of island conservation. They collected every tortoise they could find on Hispaniola and transported them to the breeding facility on Santa Cruz. 14 animals, the last biological seed of a species. Then a 15th animal appeared. from a direction nobody expected. A male tortoise had been living at the San Diego Zoo since at least the late 1940s. He had been captured as a young adult, probably sometime in the 1920s or 30s, and transported to the United States as part of a collection of Galapagos wildlife. His subspecies had never been confirmed. When the breeding program at the Charles Darwin Research Station was formalized in the 1970s, genetic analysis identified this zoo animal as a Hood Island tortoise, a native of Espanola Island. In 1977, scientists flew him from California to the Galapagos and named him Diego, after the city where he had spent 30 years of his long life. Here is a detail that rarely makes it into the conversation about Diego. He was not the most statistically productive male in the program. A second male, one he identified in records only as E5, contributed the larger share of total offspring over the program's full run. But Diego was visible in ways that E5 was not. He was loud, energetic, and conspicuously active in the breeding enclosures in ways that made him impossible for caretakers to ignore. He became the public face of the entire effort. And the thing he symbolised was genuine. 3 males and 12 females had been pulled from the edge of oblivion and given controlled conditions to breed. 3 males and 12 females plus 50 years were going to decide whether Espanola survived. The mechanics of the program were methodical and unglamorous and essential. Eggs collected from breeding females were incubated under controlled conditions at the facility on Santa Cruz, with temperature and humidity carefully managed to maximize hatching success and maintain appropriate sex ratios, since temperature during incubation determines gender in tortoises. Hatchlings were moved to rearing pens and fed diets calibrated to promote healthy shell development. They were kept in captivity until they reached approximately 5 years of age, the point at which their shells hardened sufficiently to resist the rat predation that had historically eliminated every hatchling on the island. Then they were crated, transported by boat to Espanola, and released in batches that ranged from dozens to hundreds of animals at a time. Picture the scene. Rangers carrying wooden crates across volcanic shoreline in the early morning, setting them down on the lava, opening the lids and watching animals the size of dinner plates step cautiously onto ground their species had not touched in decades. Some of the early animals stood at the edge of the thicket for a long moment before moving. The field researchers noted this in their logs. They would later understand why. As of the end of 2017, more than 7,000 juvenile tortoises had been returned to their islands of origin across the Galapagos through the captive program. Espanola received a significant portion of those releases, with batches arriving once or twice each year during the program's most productive decades. The survival rate of released animals on the island was estimated at approximately 50%, lower than ideal but far higher than the zero survival rate of hatchlings before the program began. Field teams followed up using numbered tags and eventually radio telemetry to track individual animals across the island. They monitored survival rates, movement corridors, body weight at recapture, and reproductive activity. Every piece of data fed back into the next cycle of breeding and release decisions. In 1978, a separate operation reached completion. Hunters working for the Galapagos National Park systematically eliminated the feral goat population from Espanola. The eradication required years of sustained effort across the entire island. When it was finished, the vegetation began to respond. Grasses returned. Cactus seedlings appeared in the rocky soil. But the recovery was not straightforward. Researchers studying the island's vegetation history used soil-stable carbon isotope analysis to trace changes in plant composition over the preceding decades. The organic record preserved in the soil documented a pronounced shift toward woody plants during the period of goat occupation and tortoise absence. The goats had not merely eaten the vegetation, they had restructured the competitive relationships between plant species in ways that favoured woody shrubs over grasses and herbs. When the goats were removed, the woody plants did not recede, they held their ground. The island's botanical memory had been rewritten, and restoring the original text required something the goat eradication alone could not provide. It required the tortoises. In the early years of repatriation, field researchers pushing through the dense interior found that the released animals clustered in the remnant cactus patches at the centre of the island. They seemed reluctant to move into the denser vegetation that surrounded those patches. Scientists noted this with concern. Tortoises restricted to cactus patches were not spreading their ecological influence across the island. The population was growing. The ecosystem function remained incomplete. The first generation of repatriated tortoises reached sexual maturity on the island during the early 1990s. Natural reproduction in the wild began. The program had seeded something that was beginning to sustain itself. The question was whether the animals would eventually penetrate the dense shrub cover and begin reshaping the landscape at the scale the island required. That question would take another 2 decades to fully answer. The survey team counted their way across Espanola in January 2022, and what they found was not consistent with any model of vegetation recovery that had been proposed for the island. The waved albatross, Fibastria irorata, is the largest bird in the Galapagos and one of the most aerodynamically spectacular seabirds in the Pacific. Its wingspan stretches 2.5 meters. It nests on bare ground because it must. Landing and takeoff require a clear run of open rock or earth. A waved albatross cannot push through heavy brush. It cannot navigate dense thicket. It needs space to move, and if that space disappears, the birds cannot use the site. Espanola is the only place on Earth where waved albatrosses breed. Every mating pair, every chick that survives to adulthood, every individual that carries the genetic diversity of this critically endangered species comes from a colony on the southwestern plateau of this one island. The entire global population of approximately 50,000 individuals funnels down to a single point on the map. That point is Espanola. The survey documented approximately 20,000 active breeding pairs in the colony, and the clearings those pairs occupied matched, with a precision that startled the researchers, the movement corridors of the recovering tortoise population. The tortoises were trampling saplings and woody vegetation along their regular travel routes through the interior, and those compressed pathways had opened into functional runways that the albatrosses were using to take off and land. Scientists expected the clearings to be incidental. What they found was that they were structural. The tortoises were maintaining the habitat without any awareness of doing it, the way they had always maintained it, because a tortoise moving across an island does not make a decision about land management. It moves, it eats, it tramples what is in its way, and everything downstream of that behaviour, every bird, every cactus, every lizard that benefits from open ground, benefits because of the accumulated mechanical force of large reptiles going about their lives. Here is a detail that almost never makes it into the conversation. The cactus story runs equally deep. The Opuntia. Cactus of Espanola produces fallen pads that, if left ungrazed, take root and form dense mats that compete with the parent plant and prevent juvenile cactus from establishing. Tortoises eat those fallen pads. They remove the competition. They also eat the cactus fruit, pass the seeds through their digestive system intact, and deposit them across the island in dung that delivers both seed and a dense organic fertilizer to the soil. Without tortoises, the cactus forest was collapsing from both ends, overgrown at the base and starved of seed dispersal. With tortoises, the cactus population was rebuilding, and rebuilding fast enough to surprise the researchers tracking it. As cactus cover increased, the Espanola mockingbird, which depends on cactus fruit and cactus structure for food and nesting, expanded its range. As the mockingbird population grew, invertebrate communities shifted in response to increased predation pressure on insects and small arthropods. The vegetation, the bird, the insect community, all of it reorganising around a reptile slowly moving across the island eating fruit. The system was rebuilding itself. Not the way engineers rebuild things, the way nature rebuilds things. Slowly, then suddenly. Field researchers who had been visiting the island since the early years of the programme described the change in terms that do not appear in scientific papers. One described standing in a section of the interior plateau in 2015 that had been an impenetrable wall of shrub on his first visit in the 90s. It was now open enough to see the horizon. Giant cactus trunks rose around him like columns. A lava lizard sat on a rock 3 meters away and watched him. That is not a coincidence. That is balance. By June 2021, the population of Chelonoidis hudensis on Espanola had reached approximately 3,000 individuals. The Galapagos National Park Directorate confirmed that natural reproduction on the island was now sufficient to sustain the population without new releases from the captive program. The program that had begun with 14 animals had produced something neither its designers nor its critics had predicted. It had produced an ecosystem reorganizing itself in real time. On June 15th, 2020, Diego was returned to Espanola Island. He weighed 80 kilograms. He was more than 100 years old. He had fathered approximately 900 offspring over more than 40 years in the breeding program, representing approximately 40% of the total output of the captive effort. He walked slowly across volcanic rock that he had not touched since before the Second World War. The island around him was unrecognisable from the one he had been taken from. It was better. Let me put that in context. Moving and rearing a tortoise through the captive program costs thousands of dollars per animal over 5 years of care. A single tortoise, once released, then provides decades of continuous ecological engineering at no further cost. It grazes, it disperses seeds, it clears vegetation, it maintains runways for a seabird species whose entire global population depends on that open ground. The cumulative ecological service delivered by 3,000 tortoises over 50 years of recovery represents an investment return that no human-built infrastructure project could match. This is not romantic nature worship. This is hard-nosed economics. The story of Espanola is extraordinary. It would be dishonest to present it as complete. The island's interior is still dominated in large areas by dense woody vegetation that the current tortoise population has not yet fully penetrated. The analysis published in PLOS One in 2014 by James Gibbs and colleagues concluded plainly that reinstating a species as a fully functioning ecosystem engineer takes far longer than reinstating the population itself. The tortoises are back. The island is not yet what it was. The cactus forests that once characterised much of Espanola before the whaling era are only partially restored. Large sections of the interior remain too densely vegetated for tortoises to navigate or effectively suppress. The researchers estimate that achieving true ecosystem-level recovery, not just population-level recovery, will require continued monitoring, possible active vegetation management, and decades more time. Ecological patience is measured on a different clock than institutional patience, and that mismatch creates real tension inside conservation programs. Washington Tapia Aguilera, who serves as the director of the Giant Tortoise Restoration Program at the Galapagos Conservancy, has spent years visiting fishing communities along the western coast of Santa Cruz Island and talking to families whose livelihoods depend on the marine environments surrounding the archipelago. The expansion of the Galapagos Marine Reserve over the past 3 decades has restricted access to fishing grounds that those communities relied on for generations. The transition has not been even. The economic benefits of ecotourism flow primarily to established operators and to national institutions based far from the fishing villages. The people most affected by conservation policy are not always the people who benefit most from it. Tapia Aguilera has said that any conservation program that does not address the economic security of the communities living adjacent to the protected area is building on an unstable foundation. He is right. The tortoises cannot solve that. The albatross cannot solve that. What would actually help those communities is revenue sharing tied directly to the conservation outcomes their restraint makes possible. A family that stopped fishing a reef decades ago so it could recover deserves a direct stake in the ecotourism income that reef now generates, not a percentage that filters down through institutional layers. Several researchers studying the human dimensions of Galapagos conservation have said this plainly for years. The policy has been slow to follow the science. There is a further vulnerability that no island restoration project addresses. Waved albatrosses range far beyond the Galapagos Marine Reserve during the non-breeding season, moving northeast toward the continental shelf waters off Ecuador and Peru. Longline fishing vessels operate throughout that range, dragging miles of baited hooks behind them. Albatrosses are attracted to the bait and dive on the hooks and drown. Critically endangered seabirds, with only one breeding colony on Earth, are disappearing into fishing gear on the open ocean, far outside any conservation boundary, far from any tortoise runway. 50 years of captive breeding, of painstaking repatriation, of ecosystem recovery can be incrementally undone by a fishing practice on the high seas that no park directorate has authority to regulate. That is not a failure of the restoration programme. It is a reminder that ecological recovery on an island is embedded in a world that extends far beyond any island's shores. The fishermen who set those lines are not villains in this story. They are workers in an industry responding to market demand in places where the alternatives are few. The albatross and the fisherman both exist in the same economic system. Holding one accountable for what the system produces while excusing the other is not a serious analysis. It is a way of avoiding one. January 2022. James Gibbs is standing at the edge of a clearing on the southwestern plateau of Espanola, and there are waved albatrosses all around him. Their wingspan stretches 2.5 meters. They clack their bills in the elaborate ritual they have performed on this island since long before any human ever set foot here. The thickets press in from all sides, but the clearing holds, held open by something that was almost gone. Held open by 3,000 animals that began as 14, held open by the accumulated physical weight of a species doing what it always did in the only place on Earth where it ever lived. This is what 50 years of patient, methodical, unglamorous work produced. Not a triumphant moment of discovery, a clearing, a runway, a bird that can take off and land on an island that almost forgot how to hold them. Almost nobody tells the story of the waved albatross and the tortoise runway in the same breath. Almost nobody connects the recovery of a 14-individual population in a facility on Santa Cruz Island to the survival of an entire seabird species that nests on one small plateau at the southern edge of the Galapagos chain. The two stories are the same story. They were always the same story. The ecosystem was always one system. The scientists just needed long enough to read it. What surprised you most about this one? Was it the runways? Was it Diego? Was it the idea that 14 animals carried enough biological potential to rebuild 3,000 and reshape an island from the ground up? Drop it in the comments. I want to know. If you're not subscribed yet, now is the time. We cover stories about restoration and the people who are fixing what is broken. Hit subscribe. See you in the next one.